Yesterday was a sad day. It was Corporal Nathan Cirillo's funeral. He was the Canadian soldier who was standing guard at the National War Memorial when he was attacked by a Muslim terrorist named Michael Zahaf Bibo. Bibo just came up to him and shot him dead, and then burst into Parliament itself looking to murder more. Cirillo is a hero, a brave Canadian soldier who was murdered because he was a symbol of our freedom and sovereignty. That's why he was specifically targeted. The terrorist could have killed a lot more people at the local mall or just tourists on Parliament Hill, but he wanted to kill the symbols of Canada. So, in a way, Corporal Cirillo was murdered because he represented all of us. He represented you. Could there be anything more sad than watching Corporal Cirillo's young boy at the funeral? Too young to know exactly what it means to have your father murdered, too young to know what terrorism means or what radical Islam means, but old enough to know that something terrible has been done to you and your family, and maybe to realize that something terrible has been done to your country as well. It was a grave day, solemn enough that the Prime Minister himself canceled a trip to China to attend the funeral. Yesterday was a day to honor the dead. But for the Ottawa Citizen, the newspaper of record for that city, a flagship newspaper for the post-media chain of papers, yesterday was also the day to publish an 800-word propaganda column from another convicted, confessed Muslim terrorist named Omar Khadr. Let me say that again. As the country was burying a soldier murdered by a Muslim terrorist, the Ottawa Citizen was lovingly laying out and polishing up an editorial by a Muslim terrorist. They published it online yesterday while Corporal Cirillo's family was still crying. And today in the print edition, they gave it pride of place. 2/3 of a whole page, beautifully laid out and illustrated. By publishing that terrorist propaganda last night online and today in the newspaper, they made sure it would be in the same edition as the funeral coverage in their paper. That is a disgrace. That is un-Canadian. That is disrespectful to the memory of Corporal Cirillo. That is disrespectful to every member of the Canadian Forces. That is an insult to the 158 Canadians who died in Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It is grotesque. Frankly, I am concerned that the Sun Media newspaper chain for which I write will soon be part of the same company as a newspaper like the Ottawa Citizen. They are not patriotic, they are not truly Canadian, and they're not even neutral as between our country and the terrorists. They are on the other side. They have given their newspapers' pages over to a terrorist as propaganda. Sometimes I report on what terrorists have to say. Yesterday, I showed you excerpts from a propaganda video released by the Islamic State. I did it to analyze it, to dissect it, to show how it is propaganda and the nature of its evil. When the homemade video of Corporal Cirillo's murderer is finally released, the video wherein Zahaf Bibo, according to the RCMP, says his terrorism is in the name of Islam, when that video comes out, I will surely show it to you as well. But I will not run it as some standalone editorial on its own as an infomercial. I will not run it on its own merits as if it is a legitimate view held by a legitimate person. I will show it to you as a piece of evidence to be explained and contradicted and refuted and to be damned. For that's what it is, a damnable argument of a terrorist. That is not what the Ottawa Citizen did last night and today. They did not say, we have here the propaganda of a murderer. We have the spin of someone sworn to destroy us through terrorism. Let us now rebut it, examine it, analyze it, but most of all, call it what it is, the propaganda of someone who is at war with us. They did not do that. They gave it the same treatment they would to a prominent Canadian, to an op-ed column even by our own Prime Minister. No rebuttal, no analysis, not even a fact check, not even a note anywhere that Khadr is a confessed, convicted murderer and terrorist, that he pled guilty to 5 war crimes. It's not even mentioned. Of course, there's no mention of the man Khadr murdered, U.S. Army medic Christopher Speer, or Speer's widow, Tabitha, or his 2 fatherless children, Tanner and Taryn. Of course not. Why would you mention the person he murdered if you're not even going to mention that he murdered? This on the day when we buried another murder victim. It would be like running an op-ed by 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed following another terrorist attack, without analysis or contradiction, without even noting that he was the planner for the most successful terrorist attack in history, but holding up Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as an expert in law and human rights. That is exactly what the Khadr propaganda piece was. Look at the headline. Misguided security laws take a huge toll. So they're publishing Omar Khadr's advice on national security. They are publishing a terrorist's advice on security without saying he is a terrorist, without mentioning that he is at war with us, that he planted IEDs, improvised explosive devices, along roads that Canadian soldiers might have eventually traveled on in Afghanistan. There is a reason to publish Khadr's comments about our national security. It's to show the terrorist point of view, to show what the terrorists want us to do. The terrorists want us to not defend ourselves. They want us to let liberal judges run the war on terror, not the RCMP or CSIS or our Canadian forces. It is a reminder of Khadr's complete lack of remorse. No regret for his murder, no mention even of his murder. The only victim in his op-ed is himself. I, me, my, it's all about him. I was mired in a nightmare of injustice, insidiously linked to national security, he says. I have not yet escaped from that nightmare. It's all about him, the poor thing. It's about him. He was insidiously linked to national security. That's narcissism. The entitlement, the self-centered arrogance, the denial of his crimes, the refusal to even acknowledge them. That's incredible. But the Ottawa Citizen is a party to it. They gave him a page to write that. They laid it out beautifully, illustrated with a photo. They ran this as a legitimate point of view equal to any other on their page. It wasn't Christopher Spear's nightmare, no, or his widow's, or his fatherless children's. No, it was the poor terrorist's nightmare. He murdered a U.S. Army medic in a terrorist war where Khadr was a member of al-Qaeda, and yet he says that he was insidiously linked to national security, as in he was entrapped by national security laws unfairly. He murdered a man. He was a terrorist who murdered a man, and yet he says he was unfairly, insidiously linked to national security issues. And the Ottawa Citizen ran that without a rebuttal or refutation, without even stating who he is and what he was convicted of. And they chose to run this on the very day of Corporal Cirillo's funeral. That is no accident. The Ottawa Citizen's editors are not Canadian patriots, and neither are they neutral observers on the matters of terrorism and war and national security. They are on the other side. They are enabling our enemies. How is it different to run an op-ed from a terrorist about national security without indicating that he is a terrorist? How is that different from running an op-ed, a thoughtful, passionate column from another infamous murderer about the cruelty of our prison system and how it ought to be changed without indicating who that murderer is or what he did? And to run falsehoods. Imagine letting a murderer say he was insidiously linked to a crime. Oh, it would be news that that infamous killer is still a psychopath, still completely remorseless. The alternative universe of such an op-ed would be news, proof that the murderer must die in jail. But for Khadr, the Ottawa Citizen runs it uncorrected, unedited, unremarked on, because they agree with him. By the way, do you think Khadr himself actually wrote this op-ed? Do you think he uses the word insidiously? Or other phrases like, rather than remedy the violation, or here's another line, at a minimum, end and redress the violations I have endured. Or even phrases like, quite the contrary. Do you think Omar Khadr speaks that way? Do you think Omar Khadr writes that way? He's the thug, a lifelong thug who's been in prison with other thugs for 10 years. Do you think he speaks like Winston Churchill did? Not likely. This reads like a propaganda document written by his lawyers. I hope it was written by his lawyers. It reads like it could have been written by the propaganda arm of the terrorist group itself, al-Qaeda, a group that Khadr was a part of but has never publicly renounced. Let me tell you how Omar Khadr actually speaks when he doesn't have the benefit of lawyers and the Ottawa Citizen to help make his words slippery. When Omar Khadr was at Guantanamo Bay, he was a racist, abusive, sexist terrorist. Of course he was. He was an al-Qaeda terrorist. Imagine his rage at one of his U.S. jailers who was a black woman. That's a double insult to a terrorist bigot like Khadr. According to court records, Omar Khadr called that black woman who was a jail guard, he called her, quote, a whore, a bitch, and a slave. That's how he talks. In his confession, he said that in Afghanistan, he was working for a bounty. He would be paid cash for every American he killed. He said he wanted to kill Jews. That's what he was doing. That's why he needs the Ottawa Citizen and his lawyers to pretty him up a bit, doesn't he? I'm not going to go through every word of the op-ed. I can sum it up for you. He wants to rein in Canadian security agencies. He wants to have fewer protections against terrorists. Oh, and he wants his rights. The little narcissist, the celebrity terrorist. It's all about him. He demands to be set free. He's 28 now, unrepentant, has never renounced his own terrorism or his father's, has never renounced al-Qaeda. Oh, and he still calls himself a child soldier. He's 28. He's mastered the language of victimology well, hasn't he? Of course, the Ottawa Citizen loves him. Oh, there were victims in the case of Omar Khadr. There were children. You just would never know their names. I used the Infomart database. I searched every edition of the Ottawa Citizen going back 12 years to the date of the murder. 13 years. And not once, not one single time has the Ottawa Citizen even mentioned the names Taryn Spear or Tanner Spear. Those are the names of the children whose father was murdered by Omar Khadr. They don't get a rebuttal in the Ottawa Citizen. They don't even exist, because if the Ottawa Citizen were to even name them once in 13 years, then they would have to explain who they were and what happened to their father. And then Omar Khadr couldn't have an 800-word op-ed where he didn't even mention his crimes, his 5 terrorist crimes to which he pled guilty and was convicted of by a court. The Ottawa Citizen doesn't just love Omar Khadr. They hate the Spears, because the Spears destroy the narrative that Omar Khadr is the victim, that he's the child, that he's the celebrity now, with his own guest column. You know, when he was in prison in Guantanamo Bay, Khadr would tell guards that murdering Christopher Spear was the best day of his life. Stop and think about that. Omar Khadr said that murdering a man in cold blood was the best moment of his life. The Ottawa Citizen is his newspaper of choice. Maybe Luca Magnotta will be next with a column. Maybe Paul Bernardo will be given an editorial. I know what Omar Khadr is. He is what he signed in his confession. You can see it here: a Jew-hating, woman-hating, black-hating, America-hating, Canada-hating, al-Qaeda terrorist who killed a man in cold blood. I know what he is. I'm disgusted by his narcissism, his sense of entitlement, his lack of remorse even to this day. But that does not surprise me any more than any other killer's self-serving sewage would surprise me. That's not what makes me mad today. What makes me mad is that the Ottawa Citizen chose last night and today, of all days, to publish this hateful terrorist propaganda on the day our country mourns a victim of Islamic terrorism. That is inexcusable.